IKIM Inspirasi Inforia Islami. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. You're with me, Mazlina Ismail, in this program, Great Works of the Muslim World. And Alhamdulillah, every Saturday at 6 p.m., we will have our guest, none other but Muhammad Husni Muhammad Amin, which is a Senior Research Officer at IKIM Center for Science and Environment Studies, KIAS. Assalamualaikum, Husni.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, Mas.
It's nice to have you back this weekend.
It's nice to be back.
on IKIM.
Alhamdulillah. Yes.
Alhamdulillah. So this week we'll continue our topics on great works of the Muslim world, and we'll be focusing on this person or this figure, Sa'id al-Andalusi's Tabaqat al-Umam, Science of the Medieval World. So to begin with, this we're going to learn about another book which has been described as an invaluable reference work for historians of Islamic science in particular, but also for historians of science in other cultural areas. During the Middle Ages, Muslim Spain was known as thriving center for learning and research, where students and scholars gathered to read Arabic manuscripts of earlier scientific works and study with famous teachers. One of them was Sa'id al-Andalusi, who in 1068 wrote Kitab Tabaqat al-Umam, or Book of the Categories of Nations, a work which records and classifies scientific contributions of all known nations. Now, before we discuss this work, Husni, what could you tell us more about Sa'id al-Andalusi? Al-Andalusi means from the land of Andalusia, correct?
Yes, thank you, Mas, for the question. Before that, A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi washabihi ajma'in. Right. So thank you for the question. So his full name was Abul Qasim ibn Abi Walid Ahmad ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn Sa'id al-Taghlibi al-Qurtubi. So his real name was Abul Qasim, and Sa'id was actually the name of one of his forefathers. So I think here he is just taking on the name of one of his forefather, and it's usual. It's not uncommon at all to see an Arabic name, where the name is taken. It's like in the West now, or even here when you attach the name, you adopt the name of one of your ancestors and attach the name with junior, for example. So here we know also that he was a Muslim historian of science and thought, and he is also a mathematical scientist. And rightly so, you said that Sa'id al-Andalusi, he was born in the year 1029, 1029 in Almera in Andalusia. That was what made him an Andalusian of his origin. And he was a member of the Bani Taghlib, an Arab tribe, when in the 700s, when the Arab began the Great Conquest. There is in fact a book on that, The Great Arab Conquest by Hugh Kennedy. When they spread to Europe and when they expanded the empire, some of these lands were so-called liberated because the strife that happened in this part of the world, in Europe, where the Visigothic kings, formerly vassals or formerly conquered territories of the western half of the Roman Empire, they invited Muslim rulers to come and intervene on their behalf, and in the process of doing so, Islam gets introduced into these lands, and that was what brought Islam to the Spanish region of Europe. And from there, these Muslim rulers, they started the kingdoms, unified kingdoms, which later, when the Abbasid revolution happened in 748, so these were the remaining Umayyad Caliphate. That happened when Abdurrahman III fled after his family. The Umayyad Caliphate has been overthrown. His family has been slaughtered, so he ran to North Africa and to Spain and to tell the outlying remaining territories of the Umayyad, that he was still the caliph. So that happened 300 years ago from the viewpoint of Sa'id al-Andalusi. So Bani Taghlib was one of those Arab tribes that settled in Andalusia, and he got the Nisbah al-Qurtubi because his family fled to Cordova during a civil war in Almira. What was happening during that time? So after a period of 300 years, in 130, that happened, civil war. I mean, the kingdoms, the various autonomous rulers that used to make up the Umayyad Caliphate, now they are known as the Ta'if kingdom, Tawaif, because you see the Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate is beginning to break up into autonomous kingdoms. They were fighting each other for supremacy. So that's what happened there in Almira. The civil war had caught on there. But during those time, so Sa'id al-Andalusi, well, it is quite an unusual name, because usually Arab names, they use Sa'id with the Sa, meaning, happy person, from Sa'ada, happy. But Sa'id, meaning from Sa'ada, meaning to ascend, to rise, or to fly. So Sa'id means someone who ascends. So someone who ascends, someone who goes to heights. So he grew up studying under various teachers who were scholars, famous scholars in Andalusia. One of them was Ibn Hazm, the Andalusian Polymath, who was also known for his unified scientific theory. Because it combines data from the sound senses, what we call as empirical data, the five senses, human senses, and also rational intuition. It combined these two methods, scientific methods, in order to arrive to a conclusion. So he's like the father of this scientific theory that makes use of both modes of gaining knowledge. So Sa'id al-Andalusi, he had a special interest in astronomy. So that makes him an astronomer. He was, if you see, like books like Thomas Hockney, biography of astronomers, he writes there that modern historians seem to think that al-Andalusi was a part of that group of precision instrument makers and also scientists, the most renowned of whom was al-Zarqali, another another renowned figure. And this group were the ones who compiled the Toledan tables. Now, what is a Toledan table? Supposedly, the group was based in Toledo, in Spain, and these tables were in Arabic called Zij, and these were astronomical tables. You have a book, and then you construct tables, and then there you record all the data, the astronomical data that you gain after making observations of the stars, of the sun, of the moon, of the planets. And this is an important science during that time, because they want to determine position, which is important for them to determine the direction, the prayer direction to the Qibla in Mecca, in Spain. So and then it is also important that from your location, you have a precise point on the map. When you have calculated your position, your latitude, your longitude, then you can calculate the prayer times. When does the sun move in the sky? Where is the position to
Right.
have your prayer times? Like
Mm.
Subuh, or Fajar,
Yeah.
Zuhur, Asar, Maghrib, Isha, and what have you, and all
That's
the
right.
other prayer times. When to do Duha, when to do
Mm-hmm.
Tahajjud, and all. So these astronomical tables were used to determine the determine and predict also the movement of sun, the moon, the planets relative to fixed stars. If you look up at the sky at night, you notice that some stars move because actually the Earth is
Mm-hmm.
moving, but some stars are very distant and they are large stars that to us they would appear to be fixed. They don't change their position, right?
Yeah.
But other stars maybe seem to be moving because of the movement of the Earth.
Mm.
So these tables were largely disseminated in Latin Europe during the subsequent centuries. As the Taif civil wars were happening, uh, trades were also happening.
Mm-hmm.
International relations were still going on, and there were also scholars, European scholars, who come to study with them. So Said al-Andalusi, he followed the footsteps of his paternal family,
Mm-hmm.
scholars, people who were judges, who were qadi in their times. So
Yeah.
Said sought to pursue a career as a legal officer,
Mm-hmm.
officer of the court, and because he had received a solid education in Islamic religious disciplines, and during that time you don't have so much distraction. You can master several disciplines, which to us today might not be related to one another.
Mm-hmm.
For example, during my time in the 90s, I'm sure you are in your time too, Mas.
Yeah.
We had this art stream and science streams and
That's right.
economic streams, right?
Yeah.
But in Said al-Andalusi's time, it
Mm-hmm.
is normal for people to take law, medicine, astronomy, and become as generalists as much as they can to master
Mm-hmm.
many various. That's why I think it's no surprise that during that time you can have several
Yeah.
polymaths like his teacher Ibn
Mm.
Hazm, which I have just mentioned.
Yeah.
And so, because Abu Sa'id al-Andalusi pursued legal career, he caught the attention of the Berber Amir, the local governor,
Mm-hmm.
Zanid. Uh, in 1068, he was appointed as a qadi, as a local judge. But his civil life did not stand out from many of his contemporaries of similar background. I mean,
Okay.
that's why we know him as an astronomer, as a biographer, as a historian, but not as a qadi, not
Mm.
as a judge. And
Right.
this is what sets him apart. His interest in history of science, in
Mm-hmm.
science itself, and also in astronomy. So that's so much that I can say about his background, Mas.
Wow. Astounding one. Now, besides Tabaqat al-Umam, Husni, what other works did Said al-Andalusi produce?
Yeah. So according to the historians of science, only Tabaqat al-Umam survived as an extant manuscript, meaning a
Mm-hmm.
manuscript that can be found, that is available and is being kept
Okay.
in the museum.
Mm.
Although his biographers, people who write about him, they have they recorded about five other works of his, but unfortunately these works did not survive history,
Mm-hmm.
did not
I
survive
see.
because they were destroyed. But we know of them from the records, the biographers' records when they write about Abu Sa'id al-Andalusi. So among them were Islah Harakat Najun, which is a book in which he corrected earlier astronomical tables. He wrote also Jawami Akhbar al-Umam min al-Arab wal-Ajam. It is a universal history of nations, Arab and non-Arabs. And a third book is a book which was on rectification of planetary motions and exposition of observers errors, meaning because the science depends so much on observation and being human beings observing planetary bodies, they're bound to be errors involved. Today, what in science we call as a human error, as parallax error, when our observation do not align properly, because there is so much that we can ensure to get good data, to get good observation, but in the end we are still human beings, and what we thought to that what we think we have observed is ultimately relying on human the eyes, the human organs, and these are also they have errors in them. They would introduce errors. So it is quite usual for astronomers, for scientists, to review each other's works and find the errors. So this is what scientists like Sa'id al-Andalusi were doing during that time. They review others' work and they correct and they write treatises, explaining the errors and introducing their own corrections, and that's how science developed. So and other work, the fourth work was Maqalat al-Milal wal-Nihal. This is a work on heresiology, talking about doctrines and adherence of sects and schools of thoughts. The various madhahibs in Islam. I think this is because remember what I said, that he used to study under Ibn Hazm, and Ibn Hazm himself, he was a religious scholar. Apart from being a scientist, he was also a religious scholar who initially he held on the Shafi'i madhab, and then he changed his madhab into the Zahiri, the literalist school of jurisprudential thought, and he remained in that school, in that madhab. And then lastly, the fifth book was Kitab al-Qasi, a book of minor, and we are left only with the title of the book, and the biographers offer us nothing about the content of this book. So these are 5 works that Abu Sa'id al-Andalusi left besides the Tabaqat al-Umam.
I see. Okay, thank you. Okay, now let's talk about that Kitab Tabaqat al-Umam, or Book of the Categories of Nations. What are the salient features of this book, Usni?
Yes. So the Tabaqat al-Umam is a book on a classification of sciences and of the nations. And like I said, this is the only extant, meaning existent work left to us by Sa'id. And it was written in the year 1068. That is 2 years after his death, meaning after that he died in the year 1070. So it is, I think we can count it as among the last of his works. So this book comprises of biographies of scientists and scientific achievements of 8 nations that they know in the world during that time. That's why I think the translator, Professor Sama'an Salim and Alok Kumar, they translated it as science in the medieval world. He was referring to the world where he lived in. So and the feel of these nations. What are these 8 nations? They were the Indians, the Persians, the Chaldeans, the Egyptians, Greeks, Byzantines, Arabs, and lastly the Bani Israel, the Jews.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also he made small explanation in contrast these 8 nations to why he picked these 8 nations in contrast to other nations. He doesn't deny that there exist other nations apart from these 8, but they are not disposed towards science. These 8 nations, they have their own sciences. They are very much disposed to science. They have inclination. They're very much inclined to science. But there are other nations that are not so disposed to science. They do not excel in science, such as the Norsemen, or we know today as Vikings, that
Okay.
existed north of England, the Danes or the Danish, the Chinese, which is a peculiar thing because in 915 the scholar, the traveler As-Sirafi wrote at length a lot about the Chinese people. So then we can further look into this. The Africans, the Russians, the Alains, and the Turks. So what Sa'id al-Andalusi here meant as nations, Umam, here he intends to be those who were said to have had a disposition towards cultivating or cultivation of learning. Like I said before, the Indians, the Persians, the Chaldeans, the Egyptians, Greeks, and he mentioned here Rome to refer to Byzantine, because after the year 300, the Romans were known as Byzantines. This is after the split, the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire, and what's left was the Holy Roman Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, which we also know as Byzantines. And so in this book, Sa'id offers an account of the individual nation contribution that they make to the various sciences, in arithmetic, in astronomy, in medicine, and also of the earliest scientists and philosophers. There's a section when he talks about Greeks, he talks about Aristotle, Plato, because Aristotle, apart from being a philosopher, we have to understand that Aristotle started out as a marine biologist, because he used to sit on the beach and then sit on a rock at the beach, and then he used to count mollusks, kulit cengkerang, mollusks, and then classify them, and then look at the fossils of fishes, of crabs, and all the marine life. And in other instances where he used to make suppositions or theories about male and female intelligence. He used to say that the females have so many teeth, and male have so many number of teeth. So these are the Greek philosophers who were scientists. And also mentioning, so it mentions also in his book about Pythagoras. If you remember your high school mathematics theorem, the Pythagoras theorem, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and one of them, started an academy, and they say that none shall enter the academy if they don't have knowledge in geometry, in mathematics. And so they have prerequisite entry requirements. And also he talks also about the Romans and the Christian scholars of 9th centuries and 10th centuries in Baghdad, meaning he's well informed, meaning he knows what's going on. He's in Spain, in Andalusia, yet he knows what was going on in Baghdad, the epicenter
Mm-hmm.
of Islamic civilization.
Right.
And the second half of this book contains Arab Islamic contributions. He has done talking about the contributions of the ancient civilizations. Now he's moving to talk about, you know, the Muslims' contribution in the fields of logic, in philosophy, in geometry, the development of Ptolemaic astronomy. This is when they shift. There, I think there's a movie on this called Hypatia, starring Rachel Weisz, one of my favorite actors, and they talked about how the Greeks during the time of Ptolemy, they
Mm-hmm.
began to shift from a geocentric conception of the universe
Mm-hmm.
to a heliocentric, meaning, for those who are not familiar with the term, geocentric meaning treating the Earth as the center of the universe, and all the sun, the planets, the moons, all are orbiting the Earth. We live on this Earth. We are at the center of the universe. Then the theory was shifting into a
Mm-hmm.
heliocentric theory, in which now they begin to believe that the Earth is just one of the many planetary bodies, planets, the moons
Mm.
that were orbiting the sun. Helio meaning
Right.
the sun. That is in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the observational methods. Remember that what I said before, Ibn Hazm
Mm-hmm.
talked about the empirical and the rational methods
Yeah.
combined. And then talking about calculations of trigonometry and mathematics to determine the length of the year. Uh, we have in Ilmul Falak,
Mm-hmm.
in calculating days of the month, when we are not able to observe physically the new moon, the hilal,
Yeah.
so we resort to calculations using
That's right.
hisab, right? And then
This is what we've been using here in
yes,
Malaysia.
yes.
Yeah.
So they still do
Yes.
observation. That is one of the prerequisites.
Yes.
Only when you cannot observe due to
Yeah.
if the sky was not clear or
Mm-hmm.
it's a cloudy night, then only then you need to determine, the days of the month. Still,
Right. Yeah.
but then only you resort to mathematics, to calculations.
Mm.
And then talking about eccentricity of the sun's orbit, because we believe that the Earth is among the many planets that orbit the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the sun is also orbiting something, and to this science, to this astronomy, we know that the sun is making a orbit around the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And here
Mm.
is he's mentioning eccentricity because it's not always on a straight line.
Right.
I mean, the position of the sun is also tilted in a certain degree that it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't always follow a straight path, or a perfectly elliptical orbit
Mm-hmm.
around the sun. And this is
Yeah.
how do they do this? Is by observing other
Mm.
planets. Remember what I said about fixed stars and
Yeah.
planets. And also, lastly, he talks about the construction of
Mm-hmm.
astronomical tables, the ZIJ, that after they make their observation, they gather the data and then they construct the table. So from the table, they are able to determine, discern patterns and predict when is the sun rising tomorrow, when is the new moon is going to appear. Based on that, they are able to make calculations. So, in a nutshell, the book talks about his scientific method as well as theory,
Mm-hmm.
and also his view on history and the progress of scholarship and science from the earliest appearance of human civilization and up to his own country in al-Andalus. Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
like if you remember several episodes before, we were talking about Imam Tabari and his Tarikh
Yeah.
Tabari. like
Yeah.
as a world history, talking about the start of history with the sending of Prophet Adam alayhi salam
That's
on
right.
this earth, the
Mm-hmm.
various transitions, the dual or the transitions of the dynasties of human beings up until the collapse of the Umayyad government and the remnant, the changing of the center of power from Damascus in Syria to Spain to Cordoba,
Mm-hmm.
and up to the time when Al-Andalus was thriving during his time, and this has drawn considerably scholarly attention during the last decade and a half. I mean, the last decade and a half when this book was
Yeah.
published in 1990, meaning in the 80s.
Mm.
Historians and scientists, they suddenly became interested with this book because it is a source book of scientists and astronomers of the 11th century.
You're right.
Yeah.
We're talking about Said al-Andalusi,
Yes. Right.
who wrote Kitab Tabaqat al-Umam, or Book of the Categories of Nation, where it is a work which records and classifies scientific contributions of all known nations. So, how would you like to conclude about his work or about himself at the
Yeah.
end of this?
So I think just a short conclusion. We can see that
Yeah.
from this book, the term that he uses for science, ulum, from it's a plural or a singular ilmu
Mm-hmm.
in Malay, as used by Said and other scholars of his period, we can see that it is actually a broad term, and it covers virtually all aspects of human knowledge. But this tells us something about their conception of knowledge, or rather science, because knowledge is seen as an integral unity rather than compartmentalized or segmented.
Yeah.
So we can see that every discipline relates to one another. Mas,
Mm-hmm.
if you compare now, we have very knowledge exists. I mean, in the human mind,
Mm-hmm.
knowledge exists in a very compartmentalized or segmented. If you
Mm-hmm.
remember, that's I think one of the struggles that I had in school, in universities, that some of these subjects they almost make no sense because we were unable to relate them to other subjects, much less the world outside there.
Mm-hmm.
For some of us, became really specialized at an early age without the
Yeah.
general, outlook of knowledge. We
Yeah.
become very specialist earlier on, and that has led us to a kind of blinkered
Mm.
specialization. You can be, there's the time when purportedly Albert Einstein, he was a great scientist, a physicist, and
Yeah.
he came up with the theory, the atomic, the general relativity theory, and also the atomic theory, the E equals mc squared, that led to the birth of the atomic bomb. And he
Mm-hmm.
was said to have, regretted that because it led to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now we think about it. We think about how blinkered specialization has led some people, when they become very specialized in the sciences, they don't see connection to other knowledges about the universe, knowledges about the creator,
Right.
then knowledge about metaphysics, about
Yeah.
ethics. So
Yeah.
they think that about economics or management, the management of the self.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So because of this, they are prone to be morally bankrupt. I mean, they are
Mm.
great in technical knowledge that they have, but they
Mm.
are easily enticed by, either financial corruption or moral
Yeah.
corruption. They come up
Yeah.
with dangerous inventions, and they They don't think about when-handed. I mean, really, we hear all the time about corporate espionage between countries when
Mm-hmm.
they kidnap or entice, top scientists to come to their countries and
Mm-hmm.
do illegal or morally unethical research. So
Yeah.
this is the problem that we have to think about.
Yeah.
So I think when we look at the methodology, the framework that scientists such as Abu Sa'id, Abdul Qasim Sa'id al-Andalusi using, then it can offer us some insights on how to address this problem in the present time.
Inshallah, there's a lot we can, contemplate from this discussion, Usni,
Yeah,
especially on the
sure.
knowledge part, where you shouldn't be specific in one area only. You should broaden out your knowledge and interest, and yeah,
Yeah,
we can learn that and imply that to our children, maybe to give them more exposure. Inshallah, yeah.
inshallah.
Okay, we thank you very much for this week's sharing.
Welcome.
So, inshallah, we see you again next week with other scholars, inshallah, and their works.
Yes, inshallah, we will come up
Inshallah.
with more great works from the Muslim world.
Inshallah. Until then, have a good weekend. See you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.